On the maps of the old American West, certain mail roads were marked with 3 small stars. The symbol stood for a promise the government demanded of every carrier on those lonely routes: celerity, certainty, security, speed, reliability, and safety across deserts and mountains where no railroad ran. By 1880, there were roughly 10,000 of these star routes, covering some 75 million miles a year. They were the thin thread that held a vast country together. And a small group of well-placed men had quietly learned how to turn that thread into gold, one inflated contract at a time. The central figure was Stephen Wallace Dorsey. A Civil War veteran who had served under future presidents, he moved south after the war, ran a railroad in Arkansas, and won a seat in the United States Senate before he turned 30. Charming, ambitious, and chronically short of cash, Dorsey had a gift for being where the money moved. By the end of the decade, he had attached himself to the one corner of the federal government that spent enormous sums with almost no oversight: the Post Office Department, and specifically the obscure office that awarded contracts on those starred Western routes. His partner inside the government was Thomas J. Brady, the second assistant postmaster general. It was an unglamorous title that hid extraordinary power. Brady controlled the star route contracts. He could approve a bid, and he could approve something far more valuable: an order to expedite. If a route needed faster, more frequent service, Brady could raise the contractor's pay, sometimes many times over, with a stroke of the pen and little explanation. The honest version of that power kept the mail moving through blizzards. The dishonest version, in the right hands, was a machine for printing money. In 1876, the pieces came together. Dorsey, working with Brady and a handful of trusted men, helped set up contracting firms under names like Miner, Peck and Company. The ring was a family affair, drawing in Dorsey's brother, his stepbrother, and former employees from his old tool business. On paper, they were independent Western mail contractors competing for honest work. In practice, they were a single coordinated machine, bidding against itself, controlling the routes from both ends. The man who awarded the contracts and the men who won them were now, in effect, the same interest. Here's how the scheme worked. The ring would win a route with a low, even reasonable, opening bid. The real profit came later. Once the contract was signed, the contractor would petition for expedited service, claiming the schedule was too slow and the country too dangerous for the original terms. Brady, the man with the pen, would grant it. To justify the higher pay, the conspirators leaned on padded numbers. Falsified population counts for the towns served, exaggerated dangers on the trail, and conveniently slow estimates of how fast a horse could really travel. Each adjustment was small on paper. Together they were a fortune. The numbers, when investigators finally pulled the files, were staggering. One route in the Dakotas had been worth about $2,350 a year. After expediting, it billed the government roughly $32,000. A southwestern route that started near $6,300 climbed past $150,000. Across a relatively small cluster of routes, the indictment would later allege fraud of around $400,000. By the broadest estimates, the star route frauds drained something on the order of $4 million from the Treasury, an immense sum in the money of the 1880s. It was not the first time Washington had noticed. Congress had probed the star routes back in 1872 during the Grant administration, only to see that inquiry tainted by bribery. A second look in 1876 briefly tightened the rules. But the appetite outlived the reform. Under President Hayes, the spending crept back, and in December 1879, Brady asked Congress for an extra $2 million simply to cover the ballooning costs of routes he himself had expedited. The deficit was the scandal hiding in plain sight. A bureau that was supposed to deliver mail had quietly become a faucet that would not close. There was one complication the ring had not fully planned for. In 1880, Stephen Dorsey had served as secretary of the Republican National Committee, helping deliver the presidency to James A. Garfield. The men who had handled the campaign's money now expected gratitude. Instead, once in office in 1881, Garfield installed a reform-minded Postmaster General, Thomas Lemuel James, and told his administration to follow the star route evidence wherever it led, even into his own party. It was a remarkable choice. The new president was aiming an investigation squarely at the very operators who believed they had bought his protection. Then came the gunshot. In July 1881, only months into his term, Garfield was shot at a Washington railroad station by a disappointed office seeker. He lingered through the summer and died in September. His assassin's grievance was personal, not part of any ring, yet the timing was poison for the prosecution. The reformer who had launched the inquiry was gone. The conspirators had reason to hope the whole effort would die with him, and that the files would quietly gather dust. They had not counted on the man who took his place. Chester A. Arthur was a creature of the very patronage system the scandal exposed. He had risen through New York machine politics, and many assumed he would let the Star Route cases fade. He did the opposite. Perhaps shaken by Garfield's death, perhaps sensing where history was heading, Arthur kept the prosecution alive and let it move toward trial. The case would now test something larger than a few mail routes. It would test whether a government built on favors could be made to prosecute its own friends, and whether anyone powerful would actually be held to account. The first trial opened in Washington in June 1882. It was a spectacle. More than 100 witnesses, thousands of documents, and a courtroom packed with reporters tracing every padded route and forged petition. To defend the accused, the ring hired one of the most famous orators in America, Robert G. Ingersoll, a man who could make a jury weep or laugh at will. For weeks, the prosecution laid out the paper trail, and then the case collapsed in the most damaging way imaginable. Reports surfaced that a member of the jury had been reached, that the verdict itself had a price. The verdict that emerged was a tangle. A few minor figures were touched, others cleared, the major defendants left unresolved. The presiding judge, Andrew Wiley, looked at the result and the cloud of corruption around it and set the whole thing aside. The trial that was meant to vindicate the government had instead suggested that even the jury box could be bought. For the reformers, it was a humiliation. For the public, it confirmed a bitter suspicion. The same rot that infected the mail contracts might reach all the way into the room where justice was supposed to be done. The government tried again. The second trial ran from December 1882 into June 1883, longer and even more exhausting than the first, with roughly 150 witnesses and some 3,600 documents marched before the jury. Ingersoll again commanded the defense, turning dry contracts into a story of ambitious men unfairly hounded. The prosecution had the records, the inflated routes, the trail of expedition orders. But records are not the same as a confession, and a divided ring is hard to convict when each man can point at the others and the paperwork can be read more than one way. In June 1883, the jury returned its answer, not guilty, across the board. Stephen Dorsey and Thomas Brady, the senator and the postal official at the very center of the scheme, walked out of court free men. The fraud had been real enough to drain millions and to force a temporary cleanup of the Star Route system. Yet almost no one of consequence was ever punished for it. The machine had been exposed, dismantled, and then, in the courtroom, somehow absolved. It remains one of the great Gilded Age scandals where the evidence was loud and the convictions were silent. So what did the country get for all of it? Not justice exactly, but something that outlasted any single verdict. The public disgust over the Star Route frauds, layered on top of Garfield's assassination by an office seeker, hardened the case for reform. In 1883, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, named for Senator George H. Pendleton, beginning the slow shift from a government of favors to a government of merit. The men of the ring escaped the jury. The system that made them possible did not. Sometimes a scandal fails to punish the guilty and still manages to change the country.